Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf mem. Before we start, a few short announcements. Number one, I want to explain on the new website how it's going to work with the Shabbat Dapim. Okay, this is something new. It's a new feature that's actually really useful. Um, it used to be that when you go on the website on Friday morning, it would show the Shabbos stuff once the Shabbos stuff was posted as if it's today's stuff. So the new site is programmed to now show today's daf as today's daf, but it doesn't mean that the Shabbat daf isn't up. Shabbat daf should usually be up by around 8:30, and you can get to it if you're in today's daf. It'll say next daf is the Shabbat daf. Okay. Um, Today I actually posted it earlier, and it actually appears as if it's the previous day's daf because I wanted it to just be like I was testing it out. But as soon as class is over, I will kind of switch it, and there's some explanation, which I don't want to go into why that is, but you can always, if the Shabbat daf is up, and we'll do this in general when we post our payment in advance, it's a very important feature for you to know, and it's a good feature on the website in general. There's a calendar view. You can see every daf, what day the daf is. It's great if you're behind or you want to get ahead and you want to know what dapim are coming up or whatever. It's a very good feature. And if, let's say, I'm away for a week or in the summer and I post dapim in advance, you can get to them always through the calendar function. It'll come up on the calendar of what day that is. So it's a very useful function to use, the calendar function. If you look right now, for example, it's Sunday, so it's the what the daf is there, but obviously the daf's not up yet because I haven't put it up yet. But the Shabbat daf, if you look right now on the calendar, you'll see the Shabbat daf. So it's a great function in general. It's also if you're behind and you know you're missing last week's. You can find it under tools. You can also find it in today's daf. It's right underneath the title there. It says calendar. So, or a calendar view or something like that. It's a great way to find things. So just so you know, in general, Shabbat stuff will be up. Sometimes I might even do it beforehand, okay? But it'll definitely be up by around 8:30, and you should be able to find it that way. So if you're saying, oh, I'm looking for it on today, where it used to be, it's not going to be in the same place it used to be. But again, there's two ways that are easy to get there. If you're in, let's say today, daf 40, by 8:30, you'll be able to go to next daf and it should appear there. Now, because I put it up early, there might be a bit of an issue. It might end up by accident in previous daf, and that'll switch over tomorrow automatically. It'll definitely appear in the right order tomorrow, and you could get there through the calendar view. Okay, and obviously, when we send out the links, you could get there through the direct link if you have it. So that's also an easy way to get there. Okay, that's a new feature which we're fine tuning it still, but it finally seems to be working pretty much the way we wanted it to be working. Okay, that's number one. Number two, I hadn't mentioned in class, and because I wanted to drop late, but Din and Daf this week, super interesting topic on the difference between Kochim Kalim and Kochim Kochim. And really, it was a focus when we had the Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach, which are Kochim Kalim. But in general, like, are they completely different types of korbanot? Like, do they have different goals completely? Or are they similar? Kind of the concept behind the Kochim Kochim and the Kochim Kalim. It's also a good overview shiur about really what are the Kochim Kalim, what are the Kochim Kochim, but also really in depth in terms of conceptually, what's the real difference between them. I highly recommended to listen. Also, the Shirayim went up yesterday, which also what's really good about Beyond the Daf. I know Zevachim has been a kind of complicated masechet. I'm sure you're all a little bit struggling with the difficulty. I want to say two things about it. One is, as difficult as it is, it's actually, for most of us, it's a world that we don't know a lot about, and it's kind of introducing all sorts of things that we might have heard here and there, but now can really learn them and understand them better. Maybe you'll appreciate it when you get to Sefer Vayikra and Parsha Shavua, and all of a sudden say, wow, I really understand what all these different korbanot are. And maybe even when doing Sefer Vayikra this year, it'll put things in perspective and kind of connect things to each other. That's number one. Number two, the Beyond the Daf content, I think, is super, super useful, particularly in this Masechet, because what it does is it gives you the concepts behind it. If you're getting too stuck in the nitty gritty and the details and the drashot, there's a lot of drashot and where they're getting them from Sukkim. That kind of content is specifically there to give you the perspective. Like I said about the Shirayim, is how do we view remainders? Is it something very important, or is it something really insignificant? In these two approaches that she talks about in the Shiur. And then there's like I said, kochi kochim kochi kalim. What's really the difference between them? What's the concept of pigul? Why is machshava so important? Okay, so I recommend, especially if you're struggling, and I know it might mean you don't have enough time, but if you do, that content's really useful. Okay, enough announcements. We're going to start learning. So what we started yesterday was this Idea about the Mizbeach HaPnimi, all of the 4 placings of the blood are essential. Where did we get it from? We brought this braita. It started at the bottom of Lamed Tet, it continued Lamed Tet Amud Av, it continued through the whole Lamed Tet Amud Bet, and it basically was saying that this pasuk, right, we started with asa ka'asher asa. Okay, so we have this pasuk. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, I have a study guide for today also. I've been trying to do study guides more often because I think it helps make the daf more clear. I hope it's useful. No, that's not what I want to share. One second. Okay. So we have this asa ka'asher asa. Okay, asa lapal ka'asher asa lapar chatat. Ken yaseh lo v'chiper lehem hakohen v'nislach lehem. And we darshan this pasuk very in depth. Okay, we'll just review quickly. Asa kasher asa. It doubles the language. Why? To say all this, the hazaot. Now, I want to remind you, there's 2 different things going on here with these inner offerings. Number 1, there's sprinklings, these 7 sprinklings, which are done sometimes to the parochet, sometimes to the kaporet, which was the cover on the aron, right? The parochet was the cover to the kodesh kodeshim. Sometimes, okay, there were different places where they did the hazaot, but there's 7 of them in all the places. And there's the 4 placings of the blood on the 4 corners of that inner altar. These are all done in the sanctuary. Sometimes the hazaot are done in Kodesh Kodeshim. That's what the kohen gadol does in Yom Kippur. He brings the blood into the Kodesh Kodeshim. That's the only time he does it on Yom Kippur, and then he does the hazaot inside there. Now, we started with saying the double language comes to say something's essential. Which thing? Haza'ah. Why the hazaot, the 7 sprinklings? Okay, because they're ma'akvot b'kol makom. That's where we're going to start today. Where do we see that in other places they're essential? And therefore here, if we're going to have one thing, it's going to be that. So then we have to say, so where do we get the 4, which is what we were looking for? Ken ya'aseh. Okay, because asa comes up 3 times in the pasuk. Asa kasher asa and ken ya'aseh. So why does it say ken ya'aseh? To say also the 4 placings are essential. Then we got off on this other thing, which we'll get back to later, which is the par in the beginning that says do to the par like you did to the par chatat, or like you do to the par chatat. So the whole problem with that word was, if we're already in the topic of the par halem davar shel tzibor, the communal sin offering where you bring a bull, then it just should have said asa lo. Okay, asa lo kasher asa the par chatat. Do to it like you did to the par chatat. Why does it say par? Oh, according to this, it must be par Yom Kippurim. Later, we're going to see a different interpretation that maybe it is the par halem davar shel tzibor, and then they're going to ask, well, then why does it say la par? Right, it begs the question. But right now, we're going to say it must be talking about some other par completely, par Yom Kippurim. Today, we're going to get to, okay, well, what are we learning for the par Yom Kippurim? Okay, but they want to compare the par Yom Kippurim to the par kohen Mashiach. For sure, the second par, everyone agrees, is the par that the kohen brings when the kohen gadol, when he sins. Okay, the sin offering where he accidentally taught the wrong thing and then followed it. Then chatat is a comparison to avodah zarah. We'll only get back to that tomorrow. And then, okay, we said maybe sirei regilim in that, Talmud lo lo. Okay, and then we had some other things like why this and not that, and why this and not that. Okay, and then we ended with, I didn't bring the whole braita here, we ended with the smicha and the shirayim that they're not makvim, because it says v'chiper and v'nislach. Right? That comes to teach. You're going to get atonement anyway. You're going to get forgiveness anyway, even if you didn't do smicha, even if you didn't do the shirayim. Okay, the remainders that get sprinkled on that get poured on the base of the altar. So now we're going to start our daf with Amar Mar. So let's go back to this line. Ein li ela, okay, the line that said Ein li ela matan sheva shemakvot b'chol makom. So heichal, where are these matan sheva? Where do we know that they're ma'akvot b'chol makom? Amar Rav Papa b'para u'b'negaim. Para aduma, it says in para aduma, v'hizal nochach pnei ol moed. Okay, for the para aduma ceremony, you don't do it in the temple. You leave the temple, and you stand. It's really from a distance, and you sprinkle the blood after you slaughter the para aduma there in the area where the para aduma was done. You then slaughter the animal, and you sprinkle the blood toward the ol moed. In other words, you're just facing it. Okay, but there's 7 sprinklings, and there it says chukah. Chukah means, and we'll get back to this later today, when the word chukah appears, right? How do we know it's chukah? Because it's in Parsha Chukat, right? It starts with chukah, and that means it's ma'akev. So it means every part of it is ma'akev, and from there we have, that is essential. So that's one place. The second place is the leper. In the leper ceremony, there's this oil. If you remember, they put the blood on the ear and the finger. Also, they put oil on the finger. But what's interesting there is first the kohen takes the oil and he sprinkles the oil. It's the one place where there's sprinklings of oil going on. He does a hazaav 7 times of oil. And there it's ma'akev. How do we know it's ma'akev? Because it says in the beginning of the section, Zot tiyeh Torat Mitzorah. The word tiyeh comes to teach you it has to be like this. Okay? And therefore, we have our 2 cases. So by the way, the oil, the way it works, I just wanted to point this out. Then the kohen takes the remainder, because the kohen puts the oil in his palm. I'm trying to imagine, right? Oil in your palm. So it's kind of messy if you were trying to do that. And after he does the sprinklings with it, then he takes the rest of it. Then he takes from what's remainder of it, and he puts on the ear and the toe and the finger of the kohen, also like on top of the blood after he put the blood there. Okay, that's just a side point because we've been talking about the blood. Okay, matan arba minai. Okay, so that's the 2 things. So we've resolved. That's why matan sheva is clearly ma'akev, because it's ma'akev. And if you're going to take one thing, that's the one we know is essential in some other place. So that's going to be the obvious. So v'asa kasher asa is specifically talking about that. Then we need v'chein yaseh for the 4 placings of the blood on the altar. But now the Gemara is going to ask about that and say the following. Matan arba minayin, Talmud lomar ken yaseh. That's just the quote where we learn the matan arba. Ma'ishna matan sheva, diktiva nukfilan. Matan arba nami ktiva nukfilan. Now they say, look, you got this 4 and you got this 7 from the words asa lapal kasher asa lapar chatat, right? It says asa kasher asa, double language. So why don't you just say that just like we're going to learn from there that the 7 are ma'akev, you should learn the 4. In other words, wouldn't you just think it's applying to everything in the section? Okay, so therefore, why wouldn't you learn both? So we're going to have 2 answers to this question, Rabbi Yirmiya and Abaye. Okay, there's a chart on the page, which is Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, so we'll see why that in a minute. Rabbi Yirmiya and Rabbi Abaye appear in the middle. That's because of the way I decided to organize this. But we're going to see a machlok at Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda about this. So I'm a Rabbi Yirmiya. Lo nitzcha ela le Rabbi Shimon. This drasha is only needed for Rabbi Shimon's position, and we'll see why in a minute. Ditanya. Lemala omer keren kranot shtayim, lematu omer keren kranot arba, divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda omer no tzarich, harei omer ba'ol moed, al kol amor ba'ol moed. Let's talk about this machlok. Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda debate what? What is the source? Not is it essential. What is the source for 4 placings of blood? Because it never says actually put it on all 4 corners, by the way. Okay, just so you know. It says, V'natan a kohen min adam al kranot hamizbeach. Okay, that's one pasuk by the kohen HaMashiach. By the parling davar shel tzibor, it says, U'min adam yitain al kranot hamizbeach. So now, both places, I want you to notice, it says kranot, plural. So the way Rabbi Shimon gets it is, okay, he says lamala, in the first section it says keren kranot. Now it doesn't say keren kranot. What it means is it says kranot, which includes 1 keren and a 2nd keren. That's 2. In the next section about the parlim davar shel tzibor, it says kranot again. So 2. Altogether you get 4. What does this have to do with anything? Well, if you learn 2 from the par kohen HaMashiach and you learn 2 from the parlim davar shel tzibor, right? Again, every time I'm just going to say it in the Hebrew, but the par kohen HaMashiach is the one when the kohen makes a mistake, an erroneous ruling, and then does it. And the parlim davar shel tzibor is when the beit din makes an erroneous ruling and the people follow it. So now we're going to say 2 are learned from there and 2 are learned from there. So you can't say when it says va'asa kasher asa that they're all ma'akev because there's only 2 in that section. So if you're going to say, but you have to do them, well, then you'd only get to you have to do 2. Because there's 2 in that section, 2 in that section. Now, of course, we learn altogether that every time you need 4, but it wouldn't be a compelling argument. So according to Rabbi Yirmiya, the source, asa kasher asa, is telling you, and that's the second part on the chart, that the 4 placements is ma'akev. You have to do it. Okay? And that's learned from asa kasher, that's learned from ken yaseh, because you can't learn it from asa kasher asa. You can only learn it from ken yaseh. You need something extra. Because if you just use the first, maybe it would only teach you the 7 and not the 4, because the 4 isn't even learned all from this section. That's what he says. Now, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, and that's why I put on the chart here, the Matan Arba Makvot, Rabbi Yirmiya says you can actually learn it from Asa Kasher Asa. You could. In other words, the question we asked, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is a valid question. And really, in other words, not a valid question. It's a valid point. You can really learn asa kasher asa both to 4 and both to the 7. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda learns the Matan Sheva from the words in that section of Be'ohel Moed. Okay, where does it say Be'ohel Moed? It says, V'natan min adam al kardot mizbeach asher lifnei Hashem be'ohel moed, in all moed. You have to put them on the kranot that are in all moed. What does he darshan from there? Al kol ha'amor ba'ol moed. Everything that's in all moed. Okay? In everything in all moed, meaning there's 4 corners there. Put it on all 4 corners. So he learned it from that section, which means Ashaka, Sherasaka mean you have to do things like we just said. You have to put them on all 4 corners and you have to sprinkle the 7. So this drasha asa kasher asa is not needed according to Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yirmiya's approach. So now they say, okay, so now we have to have a ping pong with Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, and that's why we have this chart about where they're each going to learn different halachot from. I could have organized the chart, what does each do with each pasuk? It's a different way to organize the same thing, but I decided to do it to include more things, because if I did it that way, there'd be a few things missing. But I did it in terms of, number 1, the source for Matan Arba, that we have, that you need 4 placements. Rabbi Shimon carrying kranot, right? Kranot twice there, kranot twice there. According to Rabbi Yehuda, be'ol moed. Now, where do you learn Matan Arba Makvot? According to Rabbi Shimon, you have to do it because it says Ken Yaseh. You needed that extra pasuk. According to Rabbi Yirmiya, you could learn it from the original. Asa kasher asa. It has to be done just like the 7. Now comes our question. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, Ken Yaseh my avidle. Okay, so if he doesn't need Ken Yaseh for the fact that the 4 placements are critical, essential, what does he do with those words? Ken Yaseh. Mebayle l'chidetanya. Okay, 3rd thing on the chart. What does he need it for? Lefisha lo lamanu lepar Yom Kippurim l'smicha u'shayarei adam minayin. Okay, so we didn't learn the par Yom Kippurim. It doesn't say anywhere. Now this goes back to what I keep repeating over and over. It doesn't give you all the details everywhere. So when it comes to the par Yom Kippurim, it doesn't say anywhere the kohen has to do smicha on that bull, right, where he has to lean his hands on it. And it doesn't say that whatever blood is left after he does all the sprinklings and the placements of the blood, he has to pour the rest on the base of the altar. So how do we know that you have to do that? So Rabbi Yehuda learns it from the words Ken Yaseh. Talmud Lamal, Ken Yaseh. Okay? Ken Yaseh means do it just like the other one. Remember, we said that leper is talking about the par Yom Kippurim, and V'chein Yaseh is coming to teach something additional. Okay, what we learn for the par Yom Kippurim from the par Yom Kippurim from the par Kohen Mashiach we haven't explained yet, but the V'chein Yaseh comes to include something additional. What's the additional? Smicha and shirayim. Okay, now the Gemara says, right? Why do you need a special drasha for that? Right? So they say, ulapar Yom Kippurim lo lamanu ha'amar. Lapar is Yom Kippurim. Didn't we already say that we compare, right, the fact that say lipal due to the par Yom Kippurim? Okay, this is the way we darshaned it anyway. Due to it, like you did to the par Kohen Mashiach, meaning everything's the same. So you don't need another pasuk Ken Yaseh to say everything's the same. To say smicha and shirayim, wouldn't that be included in the first section? So they say Yitzchak. No, it is needed. Why? You might have thought when we're comparing it and say, due to the par Yom Kippurim, the way you do to the par Kohen Mashiach, that's hanimile avoda de ma'akva kapara. That's only avoda. We already know shirayim and smicha are separate. They're not actions that if you don't do them, you're not going to get atonement. As opposed to the sprinkling of the blood, you're not going to get atonement for if you don't do it, right? These we already discussed. That was the whole thing yesterday about the shirayim and the smicha. They're not essential parts. If you don't do them, you'll still get atonement. So you might have thought that the things that we're going to learn from the par Kohen Mashiach to the par Yom Kippurim are specifically actions that are essential to the atonement process. You might have thought, maybe then the things that are not essential, maybe we don't learn to the par Yom Kippurim. Maybe you just don't do smicha. Maybe you don't do shirayim. Kamash malan. That's why we need Ken Yaseh to include an additional thing that we're going to learn from the par Kohen Mashiach to the par Yom Kippur. Still ping-ponging between them because now, so first of all, I filled in on the chart something that it doesn't say here, which is if Rabbi Yehuda learns Ken Yaseh to teach you about the par Yom Kippurim for smicha and shayrei adam. And Rabbi Shimon uses ken yaseh to say the four placements are essential. So where is Rabbi Shimon going to learn the par Yom Kippurim for smicha and shayrei adam? So the answer is I put in the chart, which is they're going to learn it from other. He's going to learn it from other psukim, and it comes up on Zevachim Nun Bet. So 12 more days we'll be there. But now they're going to ask Rabbi Shimon, "Hi ba'ol moed my avidle." What do we do with ba'ol moed? So now let's go back to the beginning. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda says be'ol moed, do it in the ol moed, in the tent, right? Which is really the parallel. That's in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. Its parallel is the Hechal in the Beit HaMikdash. So it says ba'ol moed. From there we say, right, put it on all the four corners that are in ol moed. So what does Rabbi Shimon do with that? Because he learns that already from, right? He learns the four from Kranot. So ba'ol moed ma'avid le, ba'ol moed mibai le she'im niftecha tikra shalecha lo haya mazeh. If the ceiling of the hechal was broken, there was an opening in it, it doesn't work. In other words, what does it mean it doesn't work? You can't do the hazah, okay? You can't do the sprinklings. So now, what does this mean? Okay, so what's interesting about this is, what this means is that Ohel is a tent. What's a tent? It's got a cover on it. Okay, so I want to remind you how the temple was. You might not even know, but the Azara was open. Okay, it was open air. And obviously the courtyard outside that's why things are called courtyards. These are courtyards, they're open. But the Heichal, where the Shulchan and the menorah, right, and the Mizbeach HaZahav that we've been talking about, the inner altar, that was covered. So now they're telling you can't do the sprinklings if it's not covered. That's why it says Ba'ol Moed. Okay? Now, they say, now we have another question. Okay, so our obvious question is, where is Rabbi Yehuda going to learn that halakha from? So v'idach, where's Rabbi Yehuda going to learn if the ceiling is open, you can't do the sprinklings? Me asher. It says asher ba'ol moed. So because it says asher ba'ol moed, that word is really unnecessary. That word teaches you this halakha. Okay, Rabbi Shimon, why don't you learn it from asher, and then ol moed, we're going to have to ask, what do you do with it? And with this, we'll end the ping pong. Asher lo darish. That's always the good way to end the ping pong. Oh, he just doesn't darshan that word. If he doesn't darshan that word, we can finish, right? Because otherwise we keep going back. What does he do with that? Oh, if he does something with that, where does he learn that from? And now we finished. Okay, so our first section today was to resolve two lines in the Mishnah. One was the Matan Sheva Ma'akvot B'Kol Makom. Where is that Kol Makom? And we said Para Aduma and Negaim and the leper. Then we got to this Ken Yaseh. We said, why do you really need it? You don't really need it. If you learn 7 from Asak Asher Asah, you should be able to learn the 4 from Asak Asher Asah, right? That they're essential. And we said either, Rabbi Yirmiya said either we learn it from, we really do learn it according to Rabbi Yehuda from Asak Asher Asah, and this is only for Rabbi Shimon, Ken Yaseh. Or according to Abaye, we can also learn it from Ken Yaseh. One second. I feel like I didn't say Abaye. Did I say Abaye? Did I skip something? Shelo Darish. I'm missing something here. Okay, one second. I'm Rabbi Yirmiya and Abaye. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda Omer this. Mabai Lil Chiditanya. Yom Kippurim. Yitzchak San Kapara. Rabbi Shimon Hai Ba'ol Moed. Shem Nifchat Tikra. V'Yidach Shelo Darish. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I knew I skipped something. Okay. Now we're up to Abaye. Okay, I knew there was something weird. It didn't sound like I taught it. Okay, Abaye Amar. So now comes Abaye. So we're not done with this section yet. We have one more part too. Abaye says, Rabbi Yehuda Nami Itzrich. Actually, this drasha is needed also according to Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Sal kadat hachamina midi dehave asmicha v'sheyarei adam. Ta'af agav dechtivan ukfilan lo ma'achva. Matan arba nami lo titakev ka mashmalan. What he wants to do is he wants to compare this Matan Arba to the Smicha and Shirayim. Now, even though Smicha and Shirayim we learned, you have to, right? What did Rabbi Yehuda say? Ken Ya'aseh comes to teach you that you need to do Smicha and the Shirayim in the Par Yom Kippurim. But nobody thinks it's Ma'akev, right? Remember, that was the pasuk. V'chiper alehem kohen v'nislach lo. Even if you don't do them, it's not critical. So the premise of our question was, if Asa Kasher Asa means you have to do it, it's essential, and it's teaching us about the 7, why wouldn't it teach about the 4 as well? Because it's just teaching everything's essential. Well, no, because everything's not essential, because the Shirayim and the Smicha are not essential. So if those aren't essential, even though you're supposed to do them, maybe the Matan Arba aren't essential. So even though you learn Matan Arba, let's say like Rabbi Yehuda from the words Ba'ol Moed, you have to put them on all four. It doesn't mean it has to be done that way. And if you don't do it, you're not going to get atonement. So asa kasher asa could include it, but not necessarily. So Abaye says that's why you need ken yaseh, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. Because the fact that you have to do it on all four corners doesn't mean it's essential and critical. And if you don't do it, you won't fulfill your obligation. So asa kasher asa is saying you have to do something. Maybe it's only the seven. And maybe the four is more similar, right? Obviously, you'll have to do one, let's say, or maybe two, or we don't know how many, but doesn't mean you have to do all four. Okay? So that's why we need another drasha to do it. So that's why in the end, Abaye thinks that both of them could be using ken yaseh for this matan for the four placements. And Rabbi Yirmiya thought, no, really, you could learn it all from asa kasher asa. Okay, so two different approaches here. Okay, now we get to the second part of our sugya, which is leper zepar Yom Kippur. We're still on, it's really all one section, which is we're just going through the different parts of the braita that we quoted yesterday, which I brought part of it, right, the essential part of it, I would say, if we're talking about essential parts. This was the essential part of the braita. Okay, there was a little discussion, why this, not that, why this, not that, and then the smicha and the shirayim, which was the extra, but I quoted here the real critical elements, which again, let's just go through. Asa kasher asa means you have to do the 7 sprinklings. Essential. Ken yaseh, you have to do the 4. Also essential. Leper, that's the par Yom Kippurim. Kasher asa lepar is the par kohen HaMashiach, which basically means we're going to learn from the par Yom Kippur, from the par kohen HaMashiach, the erroneous, right, when he makes a mistake, to the par Yom Kippurim. We still haven't really explained what we're going to learn, and that's what we're going to focus on right now. Leper is the par Yom Kippurim. Lamai halakha. Well, what's the halakha that we're learning from here? For this, we're going to have, 3 possibilities. The first one's going to be rejected, but then I'm going to answer that one, and then we're going to move to the second one. So, lamai halakha. Ila akev pshita. If it's to say that the laws of, right, the sprinklings of the par Yom Kippurim are essential, or the sprinklings and the placements of the blood. Okay, really the placements of the blood, I think, is the focus here. It's obvious. Why? In other words, I don't need a pasuk to compare it to the par kohen HaMashiach. I can learn it from the chapter 16 of Vayikra, where it talks about the avod at Yom Kippurim. I can learn it from there. Chukak tivbe. This is what we had before with the paraduma. If it uses the language of chok, that means it's essential. Okay, there's all these rules that tell us what's essential. Remember, in Kachim, we also said if something repeats itself, it's essential. But if it has the word chukah, it's also essential. So we could have learned it from the fact that it says chukah. It means everything done in Yom Kippur is essential. So I'm Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, l'nitzcha ela Rabbi Yehuda. Don't get confused. It's the same Rabbi Yehuda as before, but it has nothing to do with the Rabbi Yehuda position that we saw in his disagreement with Rabbi Shimon. This is a different source of Rabbi Yehuda. Da'amar, in other words, what he's going to say is, you're right. Most people think chukah covers everything, but Rabbi Yehuda doesn't. How do we know? Because listen, Rabbi Yehuda says chukah doesn't cover everything, and it doesn't cover necessarily the sprinklings. So that's why we need it for the hazaod and the matan arba. So now, why? Da'amar ki ktiva chukah advarim anasim bebigdei lavan bifnim shemigdim ma'aseh lechavero lo asa v'lo klum. When it says chukah, what's it talking about? Okay, let's talk about what it means bigdei lavan, what it means bifnim, what it means bachutz. These are all terms we have to explain. Bigdei lavan are the special clothes that the kohen gadol wore on Yom Kippur. If you remember, he changes his clothes. He goes to the mikveh every time he changes his clothes. Does the kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Certain avodot, the ones that are very unique to Yom Kippur, he does in the bigdei lavan. Now, some of those happen bifnim. Now, bifnim, until now, we've been talking about bifnim as the hechal, right, the sanctuary, where the shulchan and the menorah and the mizbech, hazahav, right, the gold altar is. But here we don't mean that. Here that's chutz, and pnim is the kodesh kodeshim, because the kohen gadol also does part of the stuff in the kodesh kodeshim. So what does Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak quote Rabbi Yehuda saying? When it says chukah, that's only talking about the very unique things that the kohen gadol does while he's in his special white clothes for Yom Kippur, and he does them bifnim. Okay, he does them in the kodesh kodeshim. And what is it teaching us about it? If you did it out of order, what it's teaching you, chukah, there is the order is essential. If he changes anything in the order in the kodesh kodeshim, it's as if he didn't do anything. אבל דברים הנעשים בבגדי לבן בחוץ, הקדים מעשה לחברו מה שעשה עשוי. But if he changes the order in the things that he does in the sanctuary, okay, still we're on the inner part, okay, but this is called chutz because it's chutz compared to its outside compared to the kodesh kodeshim. If he changes from the order there, it's okay. So now you might have thought, and this is why you need the par Yom Kippurim in our pasuk to say. Now, again, I just want to remind you, just so you don't get confused. Asa kasher asa is telling you the sprinklings of sprinklings of which of the paralim davar shel tzibur are essential. And Kenya says not only the sprinklings, also the four placements of the blood is essential for the paralim davar shel tzibur. Now, when we start saying and do to the par like you do to the par, we're saying and also and there also they assume also for the par kohen Mashiach it's essential. So now when we compare the par Yom Kippurim to that par, we're going to say and also Yom Kippurim is the same as all the others, okay? And it's essential. Now, why do we need this according to Rabbi Yehuda? Because you might have thought, just finding the place. If the order of events in the inner sanctuary, right, which is called chutzir, but if the order of events doesn't matter, maybe hazaonami lo ma'akve. Maybe, right, not that it doesn't matter, but if you didn't do it in the right way, it'll be fine anyway. Maybe also the number of sprinklings. If you didn't do all the sprinklings, maybe it's not essential. Kamash malan, that's why you needed the word lipal, which includes the par Yom Kippurim in this pasuk, which is talking about all these sprinklings that are essential. It's also essential there. But matkifla Rav Papa. Rav Papa doesn't like this answer of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. It says, umimatzit amar hachi, there's no way you could have thought that all the sprinklings and the placements of the blood in the inner altar are not essential. Of course, on Yom Kippur, okay? And I'm sorry, in the inner altar. Obviously, they're essential. How do we know? Vahatanya, it says in a braita, and not only that, according to Rabbi Yehuda, they're essential. Okay? In other words, that's what we have to prove. Because Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak was saying everyone else thinks they're essential. It's just Rabbi Yehuda who doesn't think. He says, of course Rabbi Yehuda thinks they're essential, because look at this braita. V'chila michaper hakodesh. Okay, this is a pasuk about the kohen gadol. It says when he finishes doing the atonement in the kodesh, in the sanctuary. Im kippur. So here's the drasha. Im kippur, kila. Notice kila comes first in the pasuk, but this drasha switches the order and says, if you did the kapara, meaning you did all the stages, kila, he finishes his work and it's complete. Im lo kippur, lo kila. If he didn't do everything, he doesn't get atonement. Derive Rabbi Akiva. Okay, that's useless for our purposes because that's Rabbi Akiva. We're looking for Rabbi Yehuda. Now, Rabbi Yehuda comes and disagrees, but he really doesn't disagree about the content of what Rabbi Akiva says. He disagrees about his method of darshaning it. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, mipnei ma lo nomal, im kila kipel, vim lo kila lo kiper. There's a much easier way to darshan it that you don't have to switch the order of the words. It says vikila mikaperet hakodesh. So he says, im kila, if you finish, kiper, you achieved atonement. Im lo kila, you didn't finish, lo kiper, you don't get atonement. So basically, he disagrees with the way he darshans it, but the content's the same. Rabbi Yehuda himself says, if you did do everything you're supposed to do, you're not going to get atonement. So obviously he thinks the Yom Kippur, the Hazaot, are essential. So all the sprinklings of the blood. So you can't possibly say that, Rav Papa says, that's what you need our pasuk to teach you. That's taught already from Vayikra Tetzayin in the chapter about the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur. So why are you bringing the par Yom Kippurim into our pasuk? It must be you're trying to learn something else from these laws. So now we're going to find something else. Rav Papa himself is going to find something else that's missing in the psukim of the Yom Kippurim ceremony. Now the Hazaot are obviously mentioned there in the placings of the blood, but what's missing? And it just, we didn't know it was essential, and then we say, of course it's essential. So comes Rav Papa and he says, we're going to talk about something that's missing there. Amar Rav Papa, lo nitzcha ela le'et dam ubitvilah. Okay, so what is this? This is pasuk Perek Dalid in the par Halim Davar Shel Tzibur. I'm sorry, that's a mistake. I meant to change that. In the par Yom Kippurim, okay? It's the par Kohen Gadol. Okay, I made a mistake here. This should be par Kohen Gadol, okay? This is in the par of the Kohen Gadol that he brings his sin offering. It says, V'taval ha-kohen et etzba'o badam, v'hizam min adam sheva pamim l'fnei Hashem et pnei parochet ha-kodesh. So let's look at the words. When the Kohen does the placings of the blood for the sacrifice of, again, this is the Kohen Gadol who messed up, did something wrong based on his erroneous ruling. He dips his finger into the blood and he sprinkles from the blood 7 times before God up to the parochet. Now there's 3 drashot we're going to do on this pasuk. Et, Amar Rav Bar Yaakov, lo nitzracha. And as we're going to darshan et, dam, and tava. Lo nitzracha lahachshir, turning out amubet, amin sheba'etzba. If the kohen dips his finger, and we're assuming, because we learned this before, kohen can't have a chatzitza at all. Okay, can't have a chatzitza between his finger, let's say, and the blood. What if he has a wart on his hand, on his finger? Is that a chatzitza? No, that's what et teaches you. It comes to include, even if you have a wart on your finger, you can do it. Bidam, shehei bidam, shiur tefillah mi'ikara. These are, just so you understand, these are 3 laws we learn out from this particular pasuk about the par kohen HaMashiach. What's Rav Papa saying, just so you understand where we're going? These 3 laws are relevant also for the kohen gadol. So this whole big deal we've made with this word, leper is the par Yom Kippurim, according to Rav Papa, is just teaching you these 3 particular laws about the placements of the blood on the blood in Yom Kippur. That the kohen has to dip his finger in the blood. We're going to learn these 3 drashot. Now, one is, if he has a wart, it's still okay. Number 2, bidam. Shehei bidam shiur tefillah mi'ikara. When you collect the blood from the beginning in the vessel, sometimes you collect in 2 vessels or 3 vessels or 4 vessels, right? Don't collect a little bit in each vessel and then pour them all together so that you can have enough for the kohen to dip his finger. Now, obviously, if the kohen has to dip his finger, there has to be enough to dip, right? If you put a little bit and the kohen can get his finger a little bit of blood on it, but he can't dip it because there's not enough to dip, well, obviously that's not going to be good. Well, the word bidam teaches you not only do you need enough in the cup, but you need to have enough in the cup from the beginning. When you collected it in that vessel from the slaughtering, collect enough in one vessel that you can dip. Don't collect a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, and later combine them so you have enough to dip. And the third is taval v'lo mesapeg. The word v'taval teaches you, even if you have enough in the cup, make sure that when you put your finger in, you don't take it from the sides, but you actually dip your finger in the middle of it. Okay, like sometimes you could scrape the sides with your finger and get the blood off there. That's not what we want. We want you to dip it into really where it's bloody, right, where it's liquidy. Now, itzrich lemichta bedam. Now we have to just explain why you need also bedam and also v'taval. You need to write bedam di kata rachmana v'taval havamina afagav deleka shiur tefillah mi'ikara. Kata rachmana bedam. Why do you need bedam? Because if you said v'taval, you might just think you need enough to dip in at the moment of dipping. But maybe if you collected it in small cups and then combined them, as long as you have enough at the time of dipping, it'll be fine. That's why you need bedam, to tell you no, you really need bedam. Hi kata rachmana bedam havamina filu misapeg. And if you wrote bedam, you would have thought even if, as long as you have enough to dip your finger, but you don't actually have to dip your finger, you could kind of scrape the sides. Therefore, it says v'taval. No, you have to dip it and not misapeg. So that's why you needed kata rachmana v'taval. That's why we needed both psukim. Okay, now we go to this side drasha because we're already darshaning these psukim. Okay, now we're going to Vayikra Perek Daled Pasuk Zayin, the next pasuk. It says, and the kohen puts min adam al karnot mizbeach ktoret hasamim. Okay, put it on the altar where you do the ktoret hasamim, where you also offer the incense. Now, what does that have to do with anything? We know which altar. We're obviously in the inner altar. Why are they defining it as the mizbach ktoret hasamim? Ktoret hasamim lamali sheim lo nitchanech hamizbeach b'ktoret hasamim lo hayam hazeh. We now learn this other halakha. That if, let's say, they brought in a new altar and it wasn't consecrated with the way they would get it ready for use is they would burn some ktoret on it. If you hadn't done that, you can't do the sprinklings. You have to first do the chinuch, which is, the how do you call it? The inauguration ceremony. There has to be the ceremony done to the ktoret, to the mizbeach. You have to put the ktoret asamim on first and burn them, and only after that can you sprinkle the blood. Okay, that was a side. No one really knows why this is here, just because I guess we're darshaning these psukim. Okay, now we're going to move on to which really the same sugya. So the important part we saw here, what was the purpose of par Yom Kippurim being mentioned in this verse? So one was, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, according to Rabbi Yehuda specifically, it's needed to tell you that the sprinklings are essential. And according to Rav Papa, who says, no, that's clearly essential from somewhere else, it's needed to teach you these 3 halachot, et damu b'tfilah. Okay, now we're going to have a braita that supports Rav Papa's reading. Tanya kavatei de Rav Papa. V'asa ka'asher asa, mata melomar lipal, lirabot par Yom Kippurim l'chol ma she'amur b'inyan divrei Rabbi. Okay, this is supporting Rav Papa that we're learning these halachot from here, it's also really supporting this reading. More important is that Rav Papa thinks that the par Yom Kippurim is, now, until now, we thought everybody thought that leper is coming to include the par Yom Kippurim. Okay, so that's Rebbe in this braita. There happens to be a big difference between Rebbe and Rav Papa here. I'm just pointing out, which the Gemara is going to deal with tomorrow's daf, which is Rebbe says that the word leper is mentioned here to mention par Yom Kippurim. With that is completely in sync, right? Rav Papa works perfectly with that. But he also says lekol masha amor binyan. Every halakha is learned out from there. Okay, that's these words. Lekol masha amor binyan, and that's actually not Rav Papa. Rav Papa thinks it's just for epidam v'bitfilah. So we're going to have to deal with that later. But right now, we're going to deal with the fact that he basically supports the reading that this, right, leper is the par Yom Kippurim. Now we're going to bring an opposing position in this braita. But that's really not why we brought it here, although obviously it's super interesting, and obviously the Gemara wanted to bring it. But the reason technically it's brought in the sugya is because here's a braita to support Rav Papa. That's what the Gemara says explicitly, Tanya Kavatei Rav Papa. Now we get to Rabbi Yishmael. Amar Rabbi Yishmael, I don't need to learn Yom Kippur from Par Kohen HaMashiach, from the words Asa Lapal, right? I can learn that from somewhere else. I can learn it from a simple kal v'chomer reasoning. Now, we're not going to fully understand this kal v'chomer today, but we'll read it. They're going to get into it more tomorrow's daf. Kal v'chomer. And therefore, I don't need a drasha for it. And therefore, I'll just tell you, he's going to say leper is actually the par lim davar shel tzibur. And par Yom Kippurim is not mentioned in this pasuk at all. So this whole thing we just built up about the par Yom Kippurim in this pasuk, we need some comparison. But he says, no, there's no comparison. It's not even in this pasuk. He thinks it's actually talking about itself, the par lim davar shel tzibur, which later we're going to have to ask, well, why did it call it the par then? It just sort of said it. Doesn't need to say the par. Okay? So we'll get to that tomorrow also. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma bimkom shelo hushveh korban lekorban. Okay, we can look at it down here. In a place where we don't have two korbanot that are the same, meaning we don't have the same animals. Okay, we have one korban with one animal, one korban with a different animal. Okay, it doesn't say which one. We're going to have to figure out which one. Hishveh ma'asim l'ma'asim, but they have the same actions. Even though they're different animals, they have the same actions. So makom shu hishveh korban lekorban, a place where you do have the same animal, which is our par Yom Kippurim and the par Kohen HaMashiach, where you bring a bull in both. Ein odin shu hishvu ma'asim l'ma'asim. So if in a place where you have two different animals that are brought, and yet the halachot are the same, and so wouldn't you think if you bring the same animal, obviously the halachot are going to be the same. And therefore, the fact that we compare the actions of the par Yom Kippurim to the par Kohen HaMashiach is obvious from a kal v'chomer. You don't need a pasuk to teach it, and that's why he doesn't think that's what this pasuk is coming to. Okay, so now, Amar Mar. Now, and then he has one more line here, which we're going to explain more tomorrow. Therefore, lepal, as I said before, the first par in the pasuk is the par lim davar shel tzibur. Leper ze Kohen HaMashiach, and the second one it's comparing to is the par Kohen HaMashiach. Like I said, everybody thinks the second one is the par Kohen HaMashiach. The debate is just what's the first one. Is it the par Yom Kippurim? That's what Rebbe says, and that's what Rav Papa said. And that was the earlier braita we saw said, that started yesterday's daf. But Rabbi Yishmael says, no, it's the par lim davar shel tzibur. So now we're just going to start to understand this. We're going to see what we're going to reject some possibilities. So we want to know now which are the two korbanot that are different and yet the same. So again, we have to find the animal, two different animals, but yet the laws are the same. Ilema, if you want to say par Yom Kippurim, Masir Yom Kippurim, right? We have a bull offering on Yom Kippur and we have a goat offering on Yom Kippur. Well then, and yet their laws are the same, right? There's a lot of things very similar about them. But you could say that doesn't teach you about the par Yom Kippurim and the par Kohen HaMashiach because there's a unique similarity. It could be fine, par, seir, two different animals, but both their bloods are brought into the inner, right, the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies. No other korban does that. So they're obviously going to have the same laws, and it doesn't teach you to places where, we can't say, from there we can learn to the par and the par of Yom Kippur and the Kohen Gadol. They're two totally different korbanot. Maybe the communal sin offering and the communal sin offering when it comes to idol worship. Okay? Because one you bring a par and one you bring a goat. So maybe those two, which are going to have similarities, that you bring the 7 right? There's all sorts of similarities. And then you'd say, look, they're similar. So obviously the par Kohen HaMashiach and the par Yom Kippurim are the same. But you can knock that out and say, Mala hanach shekemech haprim alav erat mitzvah yidu'ah. Those two come when you know what sin you did, right? They followed an erroneous ruling. We now realize it was a mistake. But Par Yom Kippurim that we're trying to learn out from the Par Kohen Mashiach is very different. That one just covers any sins he does. He doesn't even know what he did. It's just a general, doesn't cover any particular mitzvah, so we can't learn to there. I'm going to leave the third one, okay, for tomorrow's daf, and then we'll see what the real explanation is, okay, and how we understand Rabbi Yishmael's comparison. So just very quickly, we started with this braita from yesterday, and we started analyzing parts of it. Number one, right, what's this? Where do we see the seven? Comes up in other places. Number two, why do we need V'chein Yaseh to teach about the four? Can't we just include the four with the seven? And if the seven, Asa Kasher Asa, means you have to do everything right, seven, and the four placements of the blood. So either Rabbi Yirmiya said it's really only according to Rabbi Shimon, or according to Abaye, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, you'd need its own drasha because maybe it's more like the shirayim and the smicha. Then we went to the pars, the Yom Kippurim, and then we said for what halakha? We suggested Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said maybe just according to Rabbi Yehuda that we have to say the hazaot or ma'akavot, the sprinklings. But Rav Papa says no, that doesn't make any sense because that's obvious. Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be done in Yom Kippur. So he says it must be for these three unique halachot, et, bidam, and tefillah. Okay? And then we had the side thing about the Mizbach Torah Samin. And then we finished up with, here's a braita to support Rav Papa, which we said doesn't 100% support Rav Papa. We'll get back to that. And his disagreement with Rabbi Yishmael, who says, I don't need to learn that from the par. I can learn that from a kavachomer. This pasuk has nothing to do with the par Yom Kippurim, and it must be talking about the par Lim Davar Shel Tzibor. And then we're left with number one, trying to figure out what was he talking about as kavachomer, because it was a very ambiguous kavachomer. It wasn't clear which things he was comparing, and figure out why it says leper if it's talking about the par Lim Davar Shel Tzibor, which is already the same context. You didn't need a drasha for that, right? You could have just said, you didn't need a word for that, lepar. You could have just said, rasa lo kasher asa. So we're going to have to get back to that as well. So there's a lot still open, but hopefully by tomorrow this will all become clear. With that, wishing everyone a good day and Shabbat Shalom.